Next on News Talk AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show with Kevin Doran.
Good morning, folks. This is Bob Heineman filling in for Kevin Doran on this morning after Christmas. I hope you all had a good and fruitful Christmas, quiet and pleasant. I have with me this morning Dr. Jeff Sluyter Beltrao. Jeff has been one of my colleagues at Alfred for, 6 or 8 years now, Jeff?
A bit longer than that, actually.
My goodness, time flies. And I thought this morning we talked to him a little bit about his travels abroad for the past 3.5-4 months. Jeff has been in Brazil, and he's just returned back from Brazil with his family. And I thought, and I haven't had a chance to talk to him to any great extent about what's going on down there in Brazil. And Jeff is one of our faculty in the area of international relations, comparative government, has written some fine stuff in the area of Latin America, politics and labor movements. And so, Jeff, welcome, and let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Brazil. We hear a lot about Mexico. We don't hear much about the countries south of Mexico. And my understanding is Brazil is one of the BRIC countries. BRIC, what's that stand for there, Jeff?
It's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and actually they include an S on the end now because South Africa was also added to the list.
So what makes these countries qualify to be a BRIC country?
They're seen as emerging, sometimes called emerging economies. They're countries that were thought to be peripheral, secondary countries economically within the global economy, but they've been taking off in the past 10 or 15 years. They're growing strongly, and they tend to cooperate. They meet together, and they try to create a new sort of power base independent from the old U.S.-based Western power base, and, of course, the collapsed Soviet Union one. They've kind of tried to take the place of that, tried to create a new sort of system where they have an important role following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War.
I see. And so they have kind of an association, or is it?
Yeah, they
meet on a fairly regular basis, and this gives Putin a chance to run around it.
Yeah, they do have constant contact and occasional meetings, but they haven't actually been able to do as much as people thought they about 10 or 10 years ago. I would say was the kind of the high point when people were expecting them to become a real force. But in the past 4 or 5 years, largely due to economic difficulties and political turmoil in some places, like Ukraine and Crimea and so forth, with Russia's involvement there, they haven't really been able to coordinate much or have much of much influence.
Well, in terms of countries south of the border, Brazil qualifies for BRIC status, but Argentina, Chile, Mexico do not then.
Brazil's economy was really the powerhouse of South America in the first decade of the 21st century. And like I said, they also had a government that was willing to really take independent positions from the U.S. The main difference with Mexico is that the governments, first of all, have not been as independent of U.S. influence as the Brazilian one, and also their economy was not growing nearly as quickly as the Brazilian one during those years.
Now, we have to inform our listeners, Brazil would we say it's Hispanic or not? Because they speak Portuguese as contrasted with Spanish, right?
Yeah, they speak Portuguese, and Brazilians would not want to be called Hispanic.
Oh, I see.
It would be kind of like calling us, I don't know, something other than...
Well, please be careful there, yeah. Our guest today is Dr. Jeff Sluyter Beltrao, who's a specialist in Latin American affairs and speaks Spanish and Portuguese and a number of other languages fluently, so he can travel around down there without too much difficulty. What is the industrial power of Brazil, and are they still fairly powerful industrially, or what's the story on that?
Brazil's, as I have already said, they've grown quite consistently strongly for the past 10 or 15 years. But since 2010, the economy has kind of stalled out. And partly that's because of the nature of their growth has been largely dependent on the export of primary goods, what we call primary goods, things like agricultural products, mining, mineral products. And a lot of that has been going to China. And so their economy, in a sense, has remained very dependent on exports. Just what has shifted is that it used to be that they exported their goods to Western countries, and especially the U.S., but now they've become much more dependent on China. And as China's economy has kind of leveled off and begun to lose steam, that's really hurt Brazil in recent years.
So the Chinese have probably gone out of their way to build up economic relations with Brazil?
Yeah. They've invested a lot in Brazil. China has invested a lot in the production of goods in Latin American countries, in African countries. Right.
Yeah. My understanding is that Brazil is fairly wealthy in energy. Is that right? Oil and other forms of.
Yes. Because they were historically one of the largest producers of sugar in the world. They began producing ethanol, sugar-based ethanol, in the 1970s.
Wow!
And so you pull into a gas station in Brazil and you have the choice of 4 or 5 different mixes of ethanol with gasoline. And the cars are all built. The cars are built in Brazil, and they're built with special engines that are capable of giving you those choices. But Brazil also, however, the ethanol project has been criticized in various ways, not necessarily a huge success for them until recent years. But the other thing about Brazil is that they just a few years ago had the largest finding of petroleum reserves in the world in offshore oil. The problem with it is there's tons of it out there off the coast of Brazil. But to get at it is very difficult because it's more than a mile underground beneath these levels of salt. It's called the pre-salt basis. That's very difficult technologically to get to the oil, but they expect to begin harvesting it within the next few years.
Do they rely on the United States and our technology to get in there?
Well, that's been a huge debate. To what extent should the Brazilian petroleum industry open up to international investment? And they have needed a lot of help, and they have been gradually opening access since the 1990s to foreign investment.
So in addition to the fracking and the huge amount of oil that the United States is producing and natural gas, there are other reserves around the world, Brazil, for example, that has huge deposits of oil as well. So the idea that somehow we're going to have another energy crisis probably off base at this point. Then,
yeah, in terms of production of oil, I would say we look good for the next 20, 25 years at least.
How is it to live in Brazil? Were you driving around in your little ethanol-powered cars there? Or?
Actually, the cars we were driving in were gasoline-driven.
I see.
Yeah, believe it or not.
Can't leave your American roots. Yeah.
No, but the hardest thing coming back from Brazil at this time of year is that you leave a country in the midst of summer, and most of the population in Brazil lives on the coast, and my wife is Brazilian, and her family does, in fact, live in a city right on the coast. And so I was used to walking along the beach.
I see.
Low 90s, pretty decent weather, a lot of fun. And so you come back to Alfred, and it's a little bit different.
Yeah. Well, we're happy you came back, Jeff. But in terms of walking about Brazil, my understanding is you don't do too much of that. Is that correct?
Well, you're right. There is the one problem with walking a lot in Brazil is that it's the cities in particular have become very violent and dangerous. The crime rates have soared. In the part of Brazil in particular that I was living in, the northeast of Brazil, in large part due to the expansion of drug trafficking, and there are a lot of gangs in the city that my wife's family is in. It's become the 9th most violent city in the world.
So you mean they kill people on a regular basis there? They
do. Very high rates, higher than any U.S. city. Detroit, Houston, it's higher there. And Brazil has, of the 50 most violent cities in the world. Brazil has about 20 of them. I think was the last
20 of the 50 most violent cities in the world.
Yeah, most of them are Latin American, because again of the drug trade largely.
So the crime in Brazil, the whole drug trade, the cartels and such, not only are they located in Mexico, but they're growing and developing in Brazil as well.
Oh yeah. Huge expansion of drug trade in Brazil.
Well, the government cannot control them then, or
they are finally starting to try. They've been coming up with a whole series of procedures and planning to try to do something, but it's late in the day. And the other major problem, in my opinion, is just the lack of solid police force. Put it that way. There's a lot of corruption, and there has been historically. And the Brazilians don't necessarily trust their police either. So there are huge problems there.
Well, you were pointing out, and I guess we were talking about it, in terms of crime and violence, we worry about a place like Mexico. People would be concerned about traveling to Mexico these days. But Brazil is moving past Mexico in terms of crime in the streets. And
I would say Brazil is pretty darn close to Mexico. I mean, Mexico has, I believe, a higher rate of homicides in Brazil as a total. It's 30, 50, 40, 50,000 in the past few years there. Again, largely linked to the drug trade. But Brazil, I don't think the homicides at a national level are quite as high. But Brazilians all Brazilians that I've talked to about this just say that it's just gotten out of control and they're just traumatized by it.
So you just can't go down to the 7-Eleven and pick up a gallon of milk.
Right.
2 or 3.
My family, my wife were very concerned every time I went out, wanted to go out to buy a newspaper, get something to eat or whatever. I'm walking in the streets because it's not only that there's a high crime rate, but I don't look Brazilian. I look like I'm from somewhere else, and the assumption would be I probably have money, and so I would be kind of a target.
I see. And so the people where you live, do you live in gated communities then, or how do they deal with it?
Yeah. It's in middle class and up communities in Brazilian cities. Nobody doesn't have a wall. There are walls everywhere, and
they have private guards then?
Yeah, there's a huge private security system. And for example, my wife's family, they all live in huge high-rise residential buildings that have tremendous security systems at their bases. So it's very difficult. It's difficult to get in without,
So you live up on the 10th or 12th floor. You're probably in pretty good shape then.
We were on the 9th floor with a good view of the beach.
which you may or may not want to walk on.
Well, actually, I should say one thing about the beach. We did walk regularly at the beach, and that's not a problem because that's critical, obviously, for tourism in the city, and they have a lot of security there. So you can walk at pretty much any time along the beach without.
So if you're say a common working person, middle class or something, you're in serious trouble if you think you aren't going to be wheeling around.
Right.
And you were telling me about the one program I saw on Brazil. People travel by helicopter from one high rise to another instead of going down and
the super wealthy travel by helicopter because the cities movement in the cities by car is very, very difficult. 2, 3, 4 hour drives are common to go a few miles. And so if you can afford it, you go by helicopter. If you can't afford that, then the other thing that Brazil has the largest number of what's the word for cars that are armored? Thank you. For armored cars, it's blindado in Portuguese. But they have the largest number of armored cars of any country in the world. So that's the cheaper way to go if you can't afford.
Get yourself an armored car or get a taxi, armored taxi.
No, we did not go that way. We're not quite that wealthy.
I see, but the taxis are armored then too?
The taxis, I don't know. I didn't take a taxi.
I see. You took a chance and got in a regular General Motors product there, huh? And wheeled around.
Yeah.
So they stop you right on the street, though. Stop sign.
Yeah, people are often stopped at. Many Brazilians, late at night especially, do not stop at intersections because you can be, a group of 4 or 5 youths often will,
They'll
often
be right on you.
Will surround the car.
Well, now we're talking about industrial growth, and Brazil, it seems to me that kind of street crime and threat to your life and such would impact the ability of Brazil to develop industrially and for new businesses and small startups and things of that would constantly have problems.
I don't know. I mean, I've never seen any sort of study or any of the impact, but obviously it doesn't help. But I think a lot of companies who invest in Brazil realize that there's tremendous profits to be made despite that level of crime. In certain sectors, tremendous profits to be made, so they
go ahead.
Take the risk.
Yeah. Well, now the final point to touch on, Brazil's coming under quite a bit of criticism for their environmental policies back along the Amazon and such. Did you get back in that area at all or not?
No, I didn't get to the Amazon. But, yeah, it's true. The destruction of the Amazon continues apace, despite the fact that the party in power has historically taken positions in favor of environmental policies. And to some extent, they've succeeded in certain ways, creating special reserves in part of the Amazon, things like that. They've done some good things, but the destruction of the Amazon continues pretty much apace.
Oh, well, you see these pictures where the trees are just leveled and, and mining companies and such have gone in.
Companies, the production of soy has destroyed huge swaths of the Amazon.
Well, we're talking to Professor Jeff Sluyter Beltrao, who's just returned from Brazil and is happy to be back here, even though the weather is quite a bit colder than it is in Brazil right now. And my final question, so what are the prospects for Brazil? Does it make sense for us to work closely with them and encourage them, or are they going to wander off like some of these other developing countries and out of control?
I think the prospects for Brazil are tremendous. It's a growing country, a young country, has tremendous wealth and resources, and it has huge problems that need to be addressed. But I'm confident that they are gradually being addressed. They need above all, they need to invest in things like their educational system, which is terrible. To put it briefly, their healthcare system, which is also awful. You don't want, if you're sick, you don't want to have to go into a public hospital. You're likely to come out worse off. At least that's the joke that you hear all the time there. But no, it's a country with tremendous challenges. But the governments in the past 20 years have been solid, and they've made tremendous progress in making Brazil a less unequal country and a growing economy and creating a lot of possibilities. There have been problems with corruption, tremendous corruption scandals recently that have really hurt the political system. There's a lot of problems. People just don't believe in politicians and political parties at all. There's a lot of that alienation. It's a common problem around the world, but Brazil certainly has these problems in spades.
Well, it sounds to me like what we're talking about is some infrastructure rebuilding and improvement in government and education and healthcare and transportation, the whole thing, and get those bases under control. Maybe the people of Brazil reap the rewards. We've been talking to Jeff Sluyter Beltrao, associate professor, I believe associate professor, right, of political science at Alfred University. And I want to thank you very much for coming in and talking with us this Friday, and wish everyone a Happy New Year.
Thanks, Bob. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.